Colin, I thought about you last night, and not just because we were going to talk today, but I was eating at the NoHo Star, and when I first got to know Colin, although not know him personally, but back in the old days, he was an editor at Harper's Magazine, and Harper's was around the corner from the NoHo Star, which is going out of business at the end of the year, if any of you care. But and almost every night that I was ever there, Colin was there writing these things furiously on legal pads.
Yeah.
Is that how you wrote?
Yeah.
And so you would always see him in the back of the restaurant.
Yeah.
And at Harper's, I was very aware. I was thinking about this today, and actually, frankly, I looked up certain things. And I realized when you were at Harper's, first of all, I knew that you were sending David Foster Wallace out on the cruise ship for a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. Yeah. And you also were editing Jonathan Franzen's famous sort of literary manifesto, which everybody calls the Harper's essay. And then also you, I think, did Jane Smiley's piece about Huck Finn, how Huck Finn was actually, was that yours?
Ben Metcalf's.
Oh, because that got more hate mail than anything. She decided to take down Mark Twain, and that was a very controversial thing. But during those years, you managed, even while you had that job, and Harper's was a great magazine then, you managed to write 4 novels from 1989 to 2001. So that was a really great pace. And then you moved to Scribner, where you started editing much longer books, like...
One by you, in fact.
One by me, A Mighty Heart. I mentioned A Mighty Heart because we're kind of rare in that Colin has edited me and I've edited Colin. So we're a good team. So, you start editing quite, Rick Perlstein's Nixonland and Anthony Swafford's Jarhead, and really sort of long, and your pace of writing books slows. And it comes to this book, this fantastic book, You Belong to Me, and but it takes you 9 years. And since I'm assuming that a lot of you are writers who have to have day jobs, the question I thought we could start with is, how do you keep going for 9 years working on a novel where, especially with crime fiction, it's all about momentum and velocity, and you got to keep all these plot things in your head. And here, you clearly would work in spurts at different times. So how did you maintain that focus and that energy?
I didn't work 9 years straight. I think I had the beginnings of a book for a long time, and then started to get sort of critical mass, and that was probably about 4 years ago. And then at some point, it's clear that you're actually going to finish this book, and it has to be finished. There are people outside with hooks waiting for you. And so I accelerated on that basis alone. But the other part of it is that it's actually a very complicated story. And it took me a long time to know not only what the parts were, but how they interlock. And it's technically a very complicated book because the story goes through a set of primary characters, but also the story goes through a set of secondary or even tertiary characters that we see once and we never see them again. And these secondary and tertiary characters probably are in the book because I have this magpie curiosity about strange things, and I wanted to get them in the book. And to weave a story through all these people and also have the story conform to the necessities of a crime novel or a thriller was like putting together the proverbial little Swiss watch, and there actually are some tiny flaws in the book. But it's, I mean, there are lots of flaws, but there are new flaws that I've discovered. Anyway, so the point being, though, that and what happens, though, there is a tipping point, and then you begin to glimpse the whole thing. And I would write down the structure of the book as I thought it was going to be, and then I would write, and then I would lose that outline, and I'd make another outline that was different from the previous outline. And it's this kind of iterative process where, and at the end, I was moving the order of chapters a little bit to try to refine the momentum, and also to create differentiation and repose. I think that if you have blood and drama in one chapter, you need to follow it up by doing something very different to create a sort of energy movement. So, from a textual point of view, it was the complexity of the book. From a life point of view, it was any number of things.
Right. Well, so you say that you started with this particular idea. I mean, after 8 books, the constellations all have to be quite different. And in fact, and my impression of you is that you tend to start with some kind of world, and you start writing before you even know exactly where you're going. Is that true?
It's true, and one of the odd things is I've never abandoned a book.
That is interesting.
I've always finished a book that I've started, and I don't think that there's any good reason for that, except that I just stayed true to my own curiosity. And in the case of the next book, I think I know the next book at the beginning of it, and it happened because I was in a taxi on the Upper West Side, I don't know, 6 months ago, and I saw a very tall man, like almost 7 feet tall, walking a little bit stooped over. He was probably about 40, and he wasn't necessarily in pain, but he wasn't necessarily not in pain. And he was stooped over, and he was in a little bit of a hurry. And the tall man came into my mind. And there was something complex and intriguing and alien about him. And I wasn't even sure that he was from New York. But here he was, and he was walking by me, and I'd snapped on all the scanners and tapes and the vocal and visual thing. This was somebody really interesting. I have no idea who he is, but he started to, percolate in my mind. And so I have that, and I have some other possible things and these things start to interest me, and then I begin to kind of grow the connective story between them. It's a ridiculous way to do things, but it's the only way I know how to do it.
Well, but what happens then, in this novel, one of the key characters is an Iranian-American financier, lawyer, very, very ambitious guy. And by the time the book came out, 9 years after sort of coming up with that image, it was a little worrisome because the book was being published right into this whole Trump storm of, a supercharged
political sensitivity around these issues.
Yeah. And that was a little tricky. And it's interesting if you sort of, when you come up with an idea at a certain time, it's of the moment,
right.
But where it's going to be a decade later can be very different.
Absolutely, and I always say live by the zeitgeist, die by the zeitgeist. And you can write zeitgeisty novels that might last a little bit longer if you're careful about what you use. We had a conversation in the editing process because I have a scene at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel,
Yeah.
and at one point in the editing process, the copy editor pointed out that the Waldorf was under renovation now. So how could the scene take place in the Waldorf if it was under renovation?
It's a fundraising. It's a fundraiser gala.
Yeah, it's a big, typical New York City gala. And I kind of thought, well, you know, they're not going to be renovating it forever, and not everyone knows, and I don't want to tear up all this stuff. And you agreed with me.
Yeah.
Just, you know, you have to make those decisions.
Yeah. But that's interesting, you know, live by the zeitgeist, die by the zeitgeist, because your books do pick up on what's sort of going on. I mean, the last book, or not the last, Risk was the last one, but the Finder had a Chinese crime syndicate trying to manipulate the stock market, which was really quite timely and remains quite timely. But definitely you're interested in what's going on in terms of power and who's got power at a given moment and how they're using it. But you're not tied to headlines or anything like that.
You can get in trouble really fast that way. And also, of course, the most interesting things are not of the moment. They're not of the news. They're continuous and eternal. It doesn't really matter what's going on in current events. I mean, the most interesting things I think are what individuals do and think, and that hasn't changed.
Yeah. Again, talking about the structure, and this really, I think this was your most complicated book, wasn't it? The challenge, it's interesting in terms of, in terms of all fiction, the endings of books are key. But in terms of crime, it's really key because you've got to sort of wrap things up and not in that, horrible, two-page coda that like pulls everything together and you suddenly rush through it. But the pacing there is really important too, and it also has to make sense.
Yeah, and I'm writing crime novels that have literary intentions, for want of a better term, and so I have to resolve not only the riggings of the plot in a way that is satisfying but surprising to the reader. And I know the reader has seen a million movies and TV shows and read a bunch of books and is smarter than I am about how these things are going to get solved. So I have to try to be as smart or outsmart the reader. So there's that narrative funnel that's taking you to the climax and the ending. But if you've had real characters in the book, you also have to resolve what's happened to them in a satisfying way. And that's kind of tricky, and it takes a little while to get it right, and you kind of fail upward and get it wrong 15 or 20 times first. In the case of this book, the actual plot is resolved prior to the end of the book, and the end of the book is much more of an emotional connective moment between two characters that hopefully resolves some of that softer, more psychological stuff that I'm talking about. But you do it kind of by feel.
But it's interesting because this one, the ending is surprisingly gentle, considering what we've gone through, and that must have been kind of scary because is it too nice? Is it too? Were you worried about that?
I kind of wrote that. I wrote that ending a little bit before I figured out all the funneling of the plot, and I knew that it was my sort of end zone, that emotional moment, which I'm not going to tell you in case you.
Yeah, we're not going to give anything away.
Spoilers. But I also felt that we had been through such hell and high water by that point that, it's kind of like,
Yeah.
Nice to kind of soft focus your way out of it.
A little Vaseline could.
Yeah, it's kind of, gives, there's some hope after all of this terrible stuff has happened.
Well, Colin comes from a pretty famous Quaker family of Quakers and do-gooders, and in some of your novels there is some really twisted, dark stuff. I mean, for somebody raised.
Can't believe that.
I know it's, and you have to, as all crime writers did, but you have to figure out many different ways for people to die.
Yes, it's true.
And actually, since we're not going to give anything away from this book, why don't you tell them, this nice bunch of people, the opening scene of The Finder and how a very nice young woman dies.
It's pretty disgusting. I just better warn you right now. Those of you who I'm sort of setting you up in a bad way, but it is so fabulous. I have to tell you, it is such a fabulous scene. I've read many crime novels and edited them. This to me is like a masterpiece of just going there. Well, in a minute I'll tell you the word that is never mentioned in the scene.
Okay.
But what you need to know is that in a place like New York City, we all have sewerage. And out in the suburbs, people have septic tanks. And if you have a septic tank, every few years, you have to have it cleaned out. And to do that, you hire some guy who's in a very smelly outfit. And he has a big truck, and he backs the truck up to the kind of the big plate that's on top of the septic tank, and he lifts it up, and he takes a paddle, and he stirs around the stuff to sort of work it up. And what's in there is shit and piss and everything else that's degraded, and he takes the big machine and just sucks it all out. It's like a giant vacuum cleaner. It goes to this giant tank, and somewhere between the eastern edge of New York City, Queens and Long Island, the city moves from sewage to septic tanks, and it's actually it's variable. So in any case, the way this happened is that I have a beat up Corolla filled with a little car filled with 4 young women. I think it's 4 young women.
Yeah, I think so.
And they're driving, they work in one of these big high-rise corporate buildings, and their job is to clean the hallways, the offices, and get the paper and put it into this, into these shredding machines, the giant mobile shredding machines. And their leader is a Chinese woman who is running a scam. And she likes to go out with them afterwards, and some of them smoke a little pot, and they kind of relax, and they drive out along the Belt Parkway, and there's a parking spot where you can park and kind of relax, and this is a place where people go and do drugs or have sex in the dunes or drink too much, and you can picture dunes with broken glass and so forth. So anyway, so they're driving, and they drive out on the Belt Parkway, and they park there, and little do they know that there's someone trying to get that young Chinese woman, and they are following her. And they know exactly where she's going to be. So following that Corolla into the parking lot is a pickup truck and one of these giant septic tank trucks. And the pickup truck comes up close. It's been a while since I read this.
I know, but you're doing an excellent job.
And the guy jumps out, and they park so close on either side, doors can't open. They're trapped inside this car. And it just so happens that the young Chinese woman has needed to go pee. And so she has just prior to this moment gotten out of the car and gone over the dunes to sort of, squat in the dunes. And that's when these trucks arrive. And one of the guys breaks the window and shoves in the piping from this tank. And they reverse the flow of the tank. and they fill it with the contents of this giant tanker truck. I've not said the word shit yet. I just did. And the word shit does not appear in the scene. In any case, so then they wait there and they're satisfied that everybody in that car is really dead. And then they drive away. And it's totally disgusting and horrible. And we're still talking about it 10 years later.
I know.
And Jin Lee, I think is her name, she watches this and then she suddenly knows she's in a lot of trouble. Yeah. And she has to go on the run immediately. And that's the beginning of the book.
Now, two things. Why isn't the word shit used? Because clearly that was very important to you.
A lot of writers use shit, damn, fuck, etc. in books, and I think it degrades the language, frankly. And I wanted to see if I could write the scene without using it. And I also thought it was somehow more powerful to not actually use the word.
Yeah.
I thought you kind of, I don't know.
Well, I can remember reading it the first time. I can remember reading it multiple times. And each time you're reading along and your brain just says, no, make it not be what I think it is. I mean, you do that kind of, this can't.
Force you to,
yeah, and it just.
Understand it.
But you can see, I mean, if you're talking about the process of being a writer and what Colin does is it's the imagining of everything. Okay, what do you need to like hem in the car and who has to, and you have to stage, and you have to orchestrate it, and yet reading the scene, it never feels remotely bogged down with details. It's this sort of effortless, sweeping thing, and the timing of the scene is amazing because you do, as a reader, have those moments where, I mean, it goes fast enough, but it also goes slowly enough so that there are those moments where you keep hoping that, that it's not happening, and it does. It's a humdinger.
I think that if you want to write something memorable, you have to take some chances. You have to kind of do something interesting and memorable and take an interesting shot. I mean, there are lots of ways that Jin Lee could have been threatened, but we know all those. We've seen them all already. Yeah.
It's. I once turned down a book and then I wound up signing it up again, but it was a novel, another crime writer, and it was set in Staten Island. It was really good, except the bad guys was the Russian mob. And I turned the book down saying, the guy's a terrific writer, and the young barmaid who's in danger, she's great. But the thing with the Russian mob is they're all just thugs.
Right.
And they're thugs at the beginning and they're thugs at the end, and it's just they're not interesting bad guys. And I realized long ago that that's the whole thing about Disney movies, for instance. It's the bad guys who are really interesting,
Absolutely.
And so that particular writer went back and rewrote the whole book, and the bad guy became kind of a Rudy Giuliani character, and I bought it.
Yeah.
But your bad guys are very, very complicated and very interesting and very memorable. And I do hope that you'll read this book, because there is one moment in this book where Colin's saying you have to take risks. You'll know when the scene happens where, there's several great scenes, but there's one that I will never forget. It's magic. But talking about this and talking about risks, the tricky challenge of dealing with this genre is that there are, as you started to mention earlier on, there are conventions, there are expectations, but if you are a literary crime suspense writer, you know, you want to acknowledge those conventions, and in fact, you want to have the pleasure of having them.
Exactly.
But you don't want to be stuck with them so much. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I have, you know, here's something I'm dueling with in my head right now. In the book that I'm beginning to unspool a little bit, there's a scene where a woman kisses a man, and she's just been eating vanilla ice cream, and she sticks her cold tongue in his mouth, and she knows she's doing this, and he's very aware of it, and he thinks right away, that is an ominous sign. I'm in a lot of trouble. Simply because she's just been eating vanilla ice cream, and you know, and so that fascinates me, but I'm not sure whether she's doing this on purpose, or whether she's bad, or whether she doesn't know quite what she has just done. And I'll work my way around. She might be a little bit of both, actually. But yeah, the villains need to be really interesting, and arguably they need to be more interesting than the other characters, because, and often you see this, writers get psychically involved with their villains, and because the villains actually activate part of themselves that they can't otherwise
Right.
have activated, and the villains are really well written, brighter and smarter and more interesting to listen to and everything. So, you know, that's fun.
Yeah. But, you know, I think the hardest thing, and I think it's a challenge for you too, I know that it is to make the women interesting.
Yeah.
Because especially since they need to be desirable, they need to be, although there was a funny thing in this book where there was this one woman, she's not the main character, but she's a secondary character, but Colin's agent, who's a woman, and I both said, oh, Colin, Rebecca, she's so, you know, she's really pushy and unpleasant. And Colin said, really? I love her. She's my favorite. It's like, okay, well, let us tell you. But it's very tricky because they have to be sexy, they have to be desirable, they have to have certain kind of sexual power.
Right.
But then it becomes, they can veer into being sort of one-dimensional. And that's really...
Or the concoctions of a male imagination.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's tricky, and I certainly recognize the limitations of my perspective. You just have to keep working it, and you know, two of you told me I needed to work it, and I worked it a little some, and it was better. It may not have been perfect,
Yeah, but it's
better.
Yeah.
As a writer, I'm just as interested in women as I am in men, and so it's important to me that I get the women characters right for lots of reasons. And but it's hard, and the reverse is true. You see women who think they're writing good male characters, and they're totally fucking it up. You know, it's just no good.
Yeah.
And that makes me mad too. So of course it would make a woman reader mad if I'm trying to do a female character and not getting it quite right. I remember reading a book, I can't remember what the book was. It was written by a woman, and she had a male character running up multiple flights of stairs with an erection. And it was the same at the top as it was at the bottom. And I thought, you have no idea what you're talking about. And I can't remember what happens with the rest of the book. But that to to me was an example of the reverse of what we're talking about. And so I have to be careful too, just in the same way.
Although I once edited a pretty well-known crime writer, and he had a scene where the couple had sex 7 times in one night. And I said, Alan, this is just not physically possible. And he said, it is for me. I said, okay, well, you're gonna like intimidate your readers.
Right.
Let's cut it down. Just,
Yeah.
But he also, by the way, he had a line in his original book which said, her apartment was like her breasts, small but tidy. And then I said, as opposed to those small but messy breasts.
Yeah.
And so then he changed it to small and tidy. I said, no, that's not the point. That's not what I'm getting at. It's like, let's lose this sentence.
Did he?
Yes, in that case, but yeah, it was a little difficult. You also edit some crime writers. That's not what you mostly do, but you do have a few. And how is that for you, being a writer of the genre, to be editing them, or do you just separate it in your head?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I don't edit very many, and the ones that I do edit, I admire a great deal, and I really couldn't be their editors otherwise. Usually they have pretty complicated plots, and so my own facility with plotting becomes relevant.
Uh-huh.
And I push writers when they have the ability to be pushed, and the work kind of demands it. And I had a novel a couple years ago where all the stuff was in the book, but if we call the plot a kind of a 5-zippered helix, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The zippers didn't all line up. They didn't tooth with in the right places with the other zippers.
Mm-hmm.
And the writer was really smart and able to create the zippers that were not toothed correctly. And I said to him, you know what? I'm going to fix this for you. And so I had to kind of mentally take apart, I remember really making all these notes, take apart the zippers and then just shift them a little bit and then put them all back together again. And that's hard. That's actually kind of hard work.
Yeah.
But I love it because it's really fun. And I also would humbly submit I know how to do it.
Yeah.
So, I do it, but I only really work with people who I admire a great deal for one reason or another. And then, of course, I learn things from those writers, too.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about. So do you?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you think of something that you've learned? Is there anything, or it's just little ideas that you just have those little bingo moments?
That's a good question. I'm editing a writer right now named Jason Matthews, who was in the CIA for 33 years, and he writes these great thrillers about CIA agents. And that sounds kind of hackneyed and expectable, but in fact it's not. He's an excellent writer, and what he's done is really new. His first book won the Edgar Award and so on. There's a movie coming out. Wow. But he has the habit of lingering over a scene, maybe 6 or 7 sentences longer than I myself would linger. And yet he does it deliciously. And I do think that writers teach readers how to read their books. And what happens is the reader realizes, man, we're going to get some bad stuff sooner or later in this chapter. And he's kind of teasing the reader with talking about the streets of Istanbul are laid out, and the people lurking in the hallways. And he just teases you just a tiny bit, and that intrigues me. So that's a very subtle little thing. Like, how long do you go in the expositional setup?
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere way back when, I learned 2 what I consider to be really important tricks, which are to start a chapter really fast with some zap of language that jumps the reader into the situation, and maybe even is disorienting just for a moment, but suggests that like there's live ammo from the first syllable, the first sentence. As soon as he felt her cold tongue from the ice cream, he knew he was dead. You're going to read the next sentence.
It's true.
So that's one trick, and then the other trick on the other end of the chapter is to actually end the chapter with something that is mystifying. A lot of people will just finish the chapter with, and Bill got out of the car and smoked a cigarette and drove home. Bill got out of the car, smoked a cigarette, and drove home, comma, but not before he stopped on the bridge and looked down at the muddy waters. I mean, just something
Right.
something to push. I do this with my writers. I say, make me turn the page, force me. Don't ask me, don't beg me. Make me turn the page, and I try to do that with the ends of my chapters. And it's very manipulative, but guess what? The whole deal is manipulative.
Yeah. But it's interesting because one of the things that I would not know how to do, but you do so well, is you get to the end of that chapter, and then the next chapter is entirely different. We're someplace entirely, and in fact, we're in either somebody's monologue, or we're in a long sort of exegesis about some kind of topic,
Right.
or, I mean, you mix it up. So then there's this tension, I realize, because you've left this wanting to know what that is, but now you're being sucked into a whole other world. But in the back of your head, you're still holding on to
Yeah.
that other thing.
And how is he going to put this together?
Yeah.
And he's just done this to me three chapters in a row. God damn it.
Yeah.
How is he going to put this together? He keeps making it more difficult for
Yeah.
me to understand. And then you have to tease the reader with little clues and hints that these things do actually fit together, just in some way we don't quite understand yet. But I think that you can have the reader accept that complexity if there's velocity through the book. If you're forcing the reader to read the book quickly, and kind of a lot gets kept in the short-term memory, so that the reader's reading the story as it goes along, but having these epiphanies about how all these things connect simultaneously. That's kind of fun.
Yeah.
If you can make it happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have a few minutes for questions. Do any of you have any questions?
So
Linda.
what possessed you to come up with opening and finder? Did you just witness a septic tank being emptied and store that away?
Well, the very beginning is, I think, starts in one of these buildings where there's a big
Oh, yeah.
Mobile shredding unit.
Yeah.
And I was just, walking around Midtown, I've noticed, at the time I noticed that there are these mobile shredding units. And they, Cold Mountain or whatever they're called, Iron Mountain, they've got all these names. And the people doing it are very solemn about it, and they're in like Merrill Lynch or some big financial firm. And it occurred to me that if you really wanted to know where the best documents were in a corporation, it's the ones that are being shredded, right? Those are the ones that they don't want anybody to know about. So if you can work your way upstream to where the documents are still complete and have been put into the place to then be shredded, and you can intercept it, then that might be fun. So anyway, so that was the beginning, and then I've driven on the Bell Parkway a billion times, and I find septic tank trucks interesting. So it's just a kind of a, stuff crashes together in your head, and then you can find
you mentioned curiosity. Once you have that curiosity about something, let's say a topic, then do you go off into research? Do you use like research in your writings? Or
I
how much does that play a part?
do a fair amount of research of one sort or another. And when I emphasize one sort or another, it may just be standing somewhere and watching stuff happen. It might be on the internet. It might be talking to a person. Sometimes I'll find the person who can tell me the thing. In the case of this book, You Belong to Me, I had a friend who was a high-end immigration lawyer, and I took him out to lunch, and I said, all right, tell me the stuff you're not supposed to tell anybody. And it took him a while for me to get to that, but I kept giving him sort of hypotheticals and breaking down his lawyerly reserve to getting to the little nubbin. And he actually didn't quite realize that he had released it to me. And once he did, it was too late. And then I could encrust that with my research and so forth. But conceptually, I needed an expert to tell me the thing. Last weekend, I was at a ridiculously opulent wedding out on Long Island. It was absurd, and I hated the fact that I was going to it even before I arrived. I was in a tuxedo, and I hated it. And when I was there, I hated it. I was mad. And the reception was for 250 people, and they had enough food for 1,000 people. It was like that. And the ostentatious wealth was unbelievable. And when I picked up my family, late at night, everyone's tired and everything, I was driving my busted up old Brooklyn minivan, and there was a Rolls Royce right there. And it's like, part of me really wanted to gun it, and part of me thought, I have to make sure I don't. But what I'm getting around to saying is that I've replayed this in my head many times since then, and I realize it's a fantastic opportunity to put a scene in. There's a lot of ways I could use it, and luckily I didn't drink at all, and I was really watching and thinking about what I was seeing. And so that's research. I got really good stuff from that. And I think that writers are like that. Writers are sort of spies of the real world, and they're always kind of watching what's going on. If they're doing a job, they're seeing things that other people aren't seeing.
But one of the things that's interesting about, one of the reasons I love crime to read and everything else is, and the people who do it well, they see the whole spectrum of society. Yeah. So you have, because you're talking so much about power and money and social ills and everything else, and so you're a person who is as interested in the guy who has the roles as the rat catcher in the neighborhood.
Yep. And at this wedding, the father of the groom, who was paying for all of this, I looked him up, I checked him out afterwards, I sort of stalked him a little bit to find out who he was. He's made his wealth in what's called high yield. High yield is a euphemism for junk bonds, okay?
Right.
So he's a junk bond king in the midst of this super expensive thing, and he's feeling kingly. He's feeling like he is the monarch of all that he surveys. He's Yertle the turtle of the country club. And of course, outside, next to what is probably his Rolls Royce, is some 18-year-old kid with a Mexican last name who's from the neighborhood, who somehow got a job parking cars, and he's going to make $30 in tips tonight, which is but a tiny fraction of the amount of shrimp that's going to be thrown away at the back end of this place later in the night. So these kinds of things it's rich. It's fascinating. You had a question.
Like along the same lines of drawing inspiration from what you witnessed in your life, I was wondering, like, when it comes to writing the actual crimes and like the more gruesome parts of the plot, like you hear that writers like Daniel Hawthorne like would read, he
Well, all you have to do is read the tabloids and you get a lot of good stuff right there. Yeah, but I also have a good imagination, and it's a mix of things. Again, at this point, you have to, even if you're going to kill someone in one of the usual ways, it has to be done in an interesting fashion, I think. I mean, I've thought of a way you could kill garbage men who are in the streets, picking up your garbage, which is you put like hydrochloric acid in a glass bottle in the recycling and everything busts, and the hydrochloric acid turns into a vapor that these guys ingest. But I haven't used that yet. And I don't know,
I was just gonna ask you if there was gonna be death by wedding cake in the next.
that would probably be too obvious in this situation, but that tall man that I mentioned before, what if he is uninvited to this wedding, but is there? That should worry you.
So whether he was uninvited as opposed to not invited.
He's not uninvited, he's not disinvited, he's not invited at all.
And yet he's
not
there.
even supposed to know about this.
Yeah.
He has no reason to be there, except his reason.
Yeah.
Do you go home and write all these little snatches down, or do you have them all in your head?
They're mostly in my head. I eventually write things down a little bit, yeah.
But you're not walking around the city taking notes and.
Occasionally. I mean, if something's really, if I really need to listen to it carefully, and I have the opportunity to write. Sometimes if you start writing things down, it freaks people out. So you have to be surreptitious about it. But sometimes I'll write stuff after the fact. Yeah.
When you're writing more of the graphic scenes, how do you know like how much gore is too much, or how do you know where you find yourself in those scenes? Like, are you being too explicit? Do you need to hold back, or?
It's a good question. I'm actually, I don't like really gory horror movies myself because I don't know, I get too involved in them or something. So I don't know, I'm pretty graphic.
Well,
sometimes.
Well, you are, but you're not. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, you have to sort of look at the scenes, but they don't. I mean, I've edited different people, and there are some people. Every once in a while, you get a writer where you have a very creepy sensation as the editor that they're really kind of getting off on the gore, that they're grooving on it, and it's like you can see, they start physically, and there's just that sick feeling.
Yeah.
And Colin doesn't do that. So definitely, people get dismembered because how are you going to get rid of bodies and things like that? But it's not like you don't. He doesn't go too far.
Sometimes less is more. And if you've created the psychological components of the scene, and then you fulfill it expositionally with whatever it is, and the reader has all the information he or she needs, and then you move back into the psychological, that can be even more terrifying than, the whole long thing. It all depends.
But there's also, talking about sort of grooving on it as opposed to whatever, I'm thinking about some of the deaths in this one. You are invested in the people enough by the time they die that there's a real sadness to it.
Yeah.
And, you feel the tragedy of somebody losing their life. And it's not like you're going to sit there and cry necessarily, but there's an emotional component. Whereas those other things that I'm thinking about, you realize that the writer is writing it for that purpose. And yeah.
You can tell. And,
Yeah.
I mean, and often there are scenes of men being violent towards women, which are really
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah.
And you know, that you just throw that manuscript away, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
As far as being authentic to your character, how would you fact check something like how would you know, how to put it, if a man's running up and how would you fact check something like that?
Like that? I would surmise. But I do fact check the stuff that can be fact checked for the most part. And when I go through at the end, I make a whole list of things and it's just straight up fact checking. Spelling, this is at the corner of this and that. There's a reference to a building in Paris where a government official lived. I fact check that. I mean, I try to get all that stuff right, because if you get it wrong, you know, you lose, the veil drops, and then someone's mad at you, as they should be.
Given the complexity of crime, how extensively do you plot out or outline ahead of time?
You know, that's a really interesting question. Norman Mailer, who's much derided now, but was actually, in fact, a brilliant guy, said he never finished any book that he knew the ending of beforehand. He never finished writing any book to which he knew the ending. I have found that to be fascinating. And so my theory is that if I don't know the ending, and I'm kind of writing in a direction, there's no way the reader can know the ending. I'm not putting invisible crumbs that the reader's going to figure out if I don't have an ending that I'm leaving crumbs for. Now, at some point, you have to actually know your ending and you have to work towards it. But I'm not overly deterministic about what the ending is early on in the process. That being said, I try to make sure every little thing links perfectly all the way through, and there's no logical mistakes and errors. And you know, it's usually pretty complicated. You have to get it all right, because guys like you are reading it.
Should we, yeah, well, why don't we wrap it up, and then we can all sort of go back there and you can keep asking Colin
Okay.
questions. But thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Colin.